There is something almost embarrassing about it, really. The greatest military-industrial complex 1930s Europe had ever witnessed. The engineers who built autobahns and zeppelins and rockets that would later touch the stars could not produce a single infantry rifle that outlasted a weapon designed by a Scottish watchmaker's son in the reign of Queen Victoria. James Paris Lee never lived to see his creation become immortal. He died in 1904, the same year the British Army formally adopted what would become the short magazine Lee-Enfield Mark I. At that moment, across the Channel, German arsenals were already perfecting the Gewehr 98, a Mauser masterpiece that remains one of the finest bolt-action mechanisms ever conceived. The Germans knew they had built something superior. Every measurement confirmed it. Tighter tolerances, better accuracy at range, a controlled feed system that American sportsmen still pay premium prices to own today. And yet, walk into a gun shop in Peshawar this afternoon and you will find Lee-Enfields for sale. Working Lee-Enfields. Lee-Enfields that shepherds carry in the Hindu Kush, that poachers fear in Kenyan game reserves, that Canadian rangers use to discourage polar bears above the Arctic Circle. Try finding a functioning Gewehr 98 in active military service anywhere on Earth. Try finding a Carabiner 98 Kurds that some 19-year-old conscript is cleaning right now, preparing for patrol tomorrow morning. You cannot, because they are all dead. Every single German service rifle from both world wars has passed into history, into collections, into the hands of reenactors and hunters who appreciate fine mechanisms. They are museum pieces, beautifully made museum pieces, certainly, but museum pieces nonetheless. The Lee-Enfield is not a museum piece. It is a tool that refuses to stop working. This is a story about engineering philosophy, about what happens when perfection becomes the enemy of practical, about supply chains and colonial legacies, and the strange economics of warfare. It is also a story about numbers, staggering numbers that reveal just how differently Britain and Germany approached the problem of arming their soldiers. Between 1895 and the present day, various factories across the British Empire and Commonwealth produced approximately 17 million Lee-Enfield rifles in dozens of variants. The rifles served officially with the military forces of over 46 nations. It fought in the Boer War, the Great War, the Second World War, the Korean War, both Indo-Pakistani conflicts, the Malayan Emergency, the Mau Mau Uprising, the Suez Crisis, and every forgotten Bush war in between. It is still, this is not hyperbole, still issued to reserve and auxiliary forces in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, still carried by Canadian Rangers, still trusted. Germany, by contrast, produced roughly 14 million Mausers across all military variants between 1898 and 1945. Exceptional rifles, everyone. Rifles that American forces examined after the war and declared mechanically superior to their own Springfields. Rifles that formed the basis of nearly every successful bolt-action hunting design of the 20th century. Rifles that are now extinct in military service. The question this demands is obvious. How does a rifle designed primarily for rapid fire at close to medium range outlast weapons specifically engineered for precision? How does a 10-round magazine and a cock-on-close bolt action defeat the acknowledged king of controlled feed accuracy? How does cheap outlast expensive? The answer begins in South Africa at the turn of a century, when the British Empire discovered that its soldiers were dying in embarrassing numbers, killed by Dutch farmers carrying German rifles, farmers who had never attended Sandhurst, farmers who simply understood that the future of warfare had arrived, whilst London was still polishing cavalry sabres. The Boer War was supposed to be simple: 60,000 irregular farmers against the largest empire in human history. The bookmakers in London gave it 3 months, perhaps 4. They were wrong by approximately 2 years, and 40,000 British casualties. What happened in South Africa between 1899 and 1902 transformed British military thinking more profoundly than any conflict since Waterloo. Boer commandos, armed predominantly with Mauser model 1895 rifles purchased from Germany, demonstrated that a skilled marksman with a modern repeating rifle could neutralize entire infantry formations trained in the Napoleonic tradition. At Magersfontein in December 1899, concealed Boer riflemen killed or wounded over 900 British soldiers in minutes. The Highland Brigade walked into a wall of aimed fire that their officers simply had not anticipated. The problem was not British courage. The problem was British equipment. When war erupted, frontline British infantry still carried the Lee-Metford, a transitional design that married James Paris Lee's detachable box magazine and rear locking bolt to barrels designed for black powder ammunition. The Lee-Metford was already obsolete. Its shallow Metford rifling wore out rapidly when firing cordite-propelled rounds, sometimes losing accuracy after as few as 3,000 shots. Soldiers in South Africa reported barrels so eroded that rounds tumbled in flight, striking targets sideways when they struck at all. Meanwhile, the Boers possessed rifles that could reach out accurately to 600 yards and beyond. German Mauser engineering gave illiterate farmers a technological advantage over professional soldiers of the Crown. This was intolerable. The response came quickly. By 1904, the British Army had adopted the short magazine Lee-Enfield Mark I, the SMLE that would become legend. The design retained Lee's brilliant magazine and bolt mechanism whilst replacing the troublesome Metford rifling with Enfield pattern grooves that handled cordite without complaint. The barrel was shortened to just over 25 inches, a decision that horrified traditionalists who believed longer barrels meant better accuracy. The total length dropped to 44.5 inches, creating a rifle that cavalry, infantry, and artillery crews could all carry without modification. This standardization was revolutionary. Previously, different branches received different weapons: long rifles for infantry, carbines for cavalry, various oddities for specialists. The SMLE unified everything: one rifle, one training program, one ammunition supply, one set of spare parts. The logistics officers at Woolwich Arsenal understood something that German planners would repeatedly forget. In modern industrial warfare, the rifle that reaches the soldier matters more than the rifle that wins competitions. The Mark I underwent continuous improvement. The Mark III, introduced in 1907, simplified manufacturing whilst improving reliability. The rear sight was redesigned. The magazine cutoff, a device allowing single round loading whilst keeping the magazine in reserve, was refined. Each modification emerged from soldier feedback, from reports written in barracks and trenches and colonial outposts where the rifle actually lived. By 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination plunged Europe into catastrophe, the British Army possessed approximately 900,000 Lee-Enfields and the institutional knowledge to produce more. More importantly, it possessed soldiers trained to use them in ways that no other army had yet imagined. The doctrine was called the Mad Minute, and it would convince German intelligence officers that the British Expeditionary Force possessed impossible numbers of machine guns. What they actually possessed was something far simpler and far more difficult to replicate: 10 years of marksmanship, training built around a rifle specifically designed for rapid aimed fire. The Boers had taught Britain a painful lesson. Britain had listened, and now that lesson would be delivered to a new enemy at a canal crossing in Belgium on an August morning when the 20th century truly began. The 23rd of August 1914 arrived grey and wet at Mons, a Belgian mining town that would have remained forever obscure had geography not placed it directly in the path of General Alexander von Kluck's First Army. Approximately 80,000 British soldiers, the entire British Expeditionary Force, faced 160,000 Germans advancing in dense formations that belonged more to 1870 than the modern age. What happened next entered military legend. Private Frank Richards of the Royal Welch Fusiliers later described the morning's work with characteristic understatement. "The Germans came on in masses," he wrote, "and we knocked them over like ninepins." This was not exaggeration. German officers, trained to expect the slow-aimed fire of continental conscripts, had calculated acceptable casualty rates based on Franco-Prussian experience. They had not calculated for the Mad Minute. The Mad Minute was a musketry standard established in 1908, requiring trained soldiers to place 15 aimed rounds into a 12-inch target at 300 yards within 60 seconds. This was the minimum passing standard. Exceptional marksmen regularly achieved 30 rounds or more. Sergeant Instructor Alfred Snoxall reportedly set an unofficial record of 38 hits in 1914, though the precise documentation remains disputed. At Mons, these skills translated into slaughter. German infantry advancing across open ground encountered a volume of accurate rifle fire that their intelligence had assured them was impossible without machine guns. A trained soldier with an SMLE could work the bolt without removing the rifle from his shoulder, maintaining sight picture throughout the loading cycle. The 10-round magazine, double the capacity of the German Gewehr 98, meant fewer reloading pauses. The rear locking bolt, though theoretically weaker than the Mauser's front-locking design, cycled faster and more smoothly. Everything about the Lee-Enfield prioritized speed. The Germans possessed better rifles for precision shooting. The British possessed better rifles for killing. After-action reports from German units at Mons consistently overestimated British machine gun strength by factors of 3 to 5. Some reports claimed the British had deployed automatic weapons that did not yet exist in such numbers. The truth was simpler and more alarming. Regular British infantry could deliver rates of fire that German doctrine had not anticipated from any shoulder weapon. This advantage was professional, not technological. The German Gewehr 98 could theoretically fire nearly as quickly in skilled hands, but German hands were not skilled in the same way. Prussian doctrine emphasized massed infantry assaults supported by artillery, with rifle marksmanship considered secondary to bayonet spirit. The British Army, scarred by Boer War humiliation, had spent a decade building institutional expertise in rapid aimed fire that Germany simply could not match. The retreat from Mons eventually stabilized into the trenches that would define the next 4 years. In static warfare, the Lee-Enfield speed advantage diminished. Machine guns and artillery dominated the killing, yet the rifle remained essential. Trench raids demanded close quarters reliability. Sniping required accuracy that the SMLE, despite its combat-oriented design, could adequately provide. Mud and blood tested every mechanism, and the Lee-Enfield's generous tolerances proved more forgiving than the precisely fitted Mausers carried by opponents. By November 1918, British and Commonwealth forces had fired an estimated 2 billion rounds of 303 ammunition. The rifles that delivered those rounds were often the same weapons issued in 1914, rebuilt and refurbished, but fundamentally unchanged. The Mark III design required no significant modification despite 4 years of industrial warfare. Germany, by contrast, was already designing the Gewehr 98's replacement before the armistice dried. They knew something had gone wrong. Their engineers began searching for solutions to problems the British had solved 2 decades earlier with a Scottish immigrant's elegant bolt and a philosophy that valued pragmatism over perfection. German engineering culture operated on a principle that seemed unassailable. Precision manufacturing produced superior weapons, and superior weapons won wars. This philosophy had built Krupp cannons that shattered French fortresses in 1870. It had created naval vessels that challenged Britannia's rule of the waves. It would ultimately produce the finest tanks, aircraft, and rockets of the Second World War. Applied to infantry rifles, however, this philosophy contained a fatal assumption. The Gewehr 98 was, by nearly any mechanical standard, a masterpiece. Paul Mauser's controlled feed bolt action remains the gold standard against which all sporting rifles are measured over a century later. The front-locking lugs distributed firing stress more evenly than Lee's rear-locking design. The non-rotating claw extractor maintained positive control of cartridges throughout the feeding cycle, virtually eliminating double feeds and extraction failures. Accuracy from the factory exceeded what British arsenals could achieve without hand-fitting. None of this mattered as much as Germans believed. The Gewehr 98's bolt required 90 degrees of rotation to unlock, compared to 60 degrees for the Lee-Enfield. This difference, 30 degrees, translated into measurably slower cycling for the average soldier. The 5-round internal magazine, loaded via stripper clips, held half the ammunition of the British 10-round detachable box. The overall length of 49 inches made the rifle unwieldy in trenches, vehicles, and urban combat. German soldiers nicknamed it the broomstick for reasons that were not affectionate. By 1935, German ordnance officers recognized these limitations and began developing the Karabiner 98 Kurz, a shortened version measuring just under 44 inches. This modification acknowledged what the British had understood since 1904. Shorter rifles served modern soldiers better. Yet the fundamental Mauser action remained unchanged. The 5-round magazine remained unchanged. The slow bolt throw remained unchanged. Germany entered the Second World War with approximately 4 million Karabiner 98 Kurz rifles either manufactured or in production. These weapons performed adequately across every theatre from Norway to North Africa to the Eastern Front. German infantry remained dangerous opponents, but the rifle was already conceptually obsolete before the first shot at Poland, and German planners knew it. What followed was a procurement catastrophe that historians still struggle to explain. Between 1939 and 1945, Germany adopted, produced, and abandoned an astonishing succession of rifle designs. The Gewehr 41, Mauser, and Gewehr 41 Walther were semi-automatic attempts that both failed miserably in field conditions. The Gewehr 43 addressed some problems whilst introducing others, never achieving reliability comparable to the American M1 Garand. The Fallschirmjäger Gewehr 42 was a magnificent automatic rifle produced in numbers too small to matter. The Sturmgewehr 44, the genuine innovation that influenced all subsequent assault rifle design, arrived too late and in insufficient quantities to affect outcomes. Meanwhile, every German soldier still needed a rifle, and that rifle remained the Karabiner 98 Kurz, a design fundamentally unchanged from 1935, itself merely a shortened version of an 1898 original. The contrast with British procurement is stark. The Lee-Enfield Mark IV, introduced in 1941, was essentially a simplified Mark III designed for faster wartime production. The action remained identical to rifles manufactured in 1907. The caliber remained the same, .303 British, that soldiers had fired at Mons. The magazine capacity remained 10 rounds. A soldier from 1914 could have picked up a Mark IV and operated it without instruction. This was not technological